Thank you, Dr. Ray, and it's a real pleasure to be here back in our community at CTS and also to be working with Vanessa and look forward to it. We've decided to break our time together. I'm going to give a little introduction and talk mostly on refugee issues, and then Vanessa is going to spend more time on the immigration in the time we have, and then we'll look forward to your questions and the like. And it is so good to be with you. I give thanks to CTS, and I was especially inspired by Professor Dr. Andre Lecoq in the Hebrew Bible and in my work with immigrants and refugees. And he's become a lifelong mentor, friend, and continues to inspire with his work. And as I look around, I'm also grateful for the community of friends in Chicago, those I went to school with, Reverend Betsy Bichelle, Reverend Martha Pierce, and others in this group, and Sisters Joanne and Pat, who are with us, who were constantly in the streets, in the prisons, and the detention centers that continue to inspire me. And my wife, Chris and Sarah, also, who was a daily inspiration. So we've been asked to talk about what we can expect from the Harris-Biden administration coming down the pike in less than 45 days, I believe. Many have seen it as an election for change. We've seen over 400 major changes to immigration and refugee law under the current administration. Some by executive order, some by administrative regulation, some by new court decisions authored by the attorneys general under this administration, increased enforcement, increased detention, and deportation. We've seen our government offices transform from offices of service to offices of enforcement, to detention and deportation. It has been a tremendous change. With the election, there was great hope for change, but we, in typical UCC style, offered a punctuation mark in our title, adding a question mark to how much of a new day this new administration will bring. As I mentioned, I'm going to give a little bit of introduction and then talk about mostly refugee issues, Vanessa on immigration, and then whatever we miss, you'll call us and ask us, and we can move from that. Is that right, Vanessa? Great. The media for the last 15, 20 years talks often about unlawful immigration, and folks who follow this with any sort of interest, it seems that all we talk about, but when I often ask people, do you know how many lawful immigrants come into the United States every year? How much do we really know about the lawful immigration program? I won't ask that quiz here, but for 20 or 30 years, it was roughly 700,000 to 1 million every year. And few people realize that how important immigrants are and how important that is, and what this current administration is doing to dismantle even that system. I can't teach you all of immigration law, but roughly about 500 to 600,000 a year come in through family reunification, a priority of our law. Another 120, 30,000 through employment. We get anywhere from 100,000 to 15,000 resettled refugees. We might get up to 100,000 asylum grants. That's a little high. 50,000 a diversity visa. You put those numbers all together, we get close to 1 million a year. And I'm grateful for that. And I think as a nation of immigrants, it's important to remember that. And too often we think, oh, they're all unlawful, and realize that how many of our families, our communities, our faith-based communities, our churches, synagogues, and mosques are helped by those immigrants. Our refugee system really grew out of World War II and the tragedies of the Holocaust, when the nations realized that the nation state system was not very good at dealing with people who were forced out of a country and somewhere between borders. And they were kind of like floating like jetsam on the oceans. And we see that today. And so out of the Holocaust, this idea was that if you're a refugee, we shouldn't force you to wait in line to go through a year or two of immigration processing. Just imagine with me, if you had to fill the paperwork and go to the police office, when that police officer is persecuting you, would you be able to ever come as a refugee? No. So the idea was, if you're seeking refuge from persecution, that the nation states who agreed to this international convention on refugees would say, come in, We will process you. We will discern whether you're a bona fide refugee. If you are, welcome, come join us. If you're not, please go back and wait online. It took us till 1980 to have the Refugee Act of 1980, but the idea was regardless of your status, you could apply, and then we would determine it, and if you were really at harm's risk, come in, otherwise go back. This administration has turned that upside down and says, no way, we're not going to process you. And I'll get into that in a second. I've been working with immigration law since I left CT, or actually since I started at CTS. And we've always had these claims of the system being broken, but at least it worked. We'd get those $1 million a year. We developed lawyers and many volunteer lawyers to help pro bono, and many faith communities helped with sanctuary and offering hospitality. But this administration intentionally, as I said, tried to dismantle it, to scare people from getting benefits, both refugees at the border and citizens and lawful permanent residents and individuals inside the country who are entitled to benefits. And policies designed to scare people. So what happened real quickly, because we're going to say, what do we have to change? So we had the system, then this administration came in, and real quickly, the major refugee things, first thing, within a week or two, the travel ban, the Muslim travel ban. We're afraid of you, you can't come in. They did it so quickly, they had to rewrite it 3 times before the Supreme Court would finally say, okay, this kind of passes muster, but we do remember the protests at the airports and the like. Then this idea of people coming to our borders, remember the big scare, the caravan and like, they started with metering. Oh, we can only take so many refugees a day. And then if you out to that 10 or 20 at a port of entry, you can't come in, come another day, right? Force you back. The biggest change was the Migrant Protection Protocol. And this said, if you come in and seek entry and say, I'm afraid, instead of letting you work the process in this country, we'll take a paper, give you, and come back in 6 to 8 weeks. Go back to Mexico, go back to wherever, right? Well, most of the grouping coming in the Mexican border would have to go back to Mexico, right? And we all know there's issues with rule of law in Mexico, already problems. And so forcing people who fled persecution from Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, who worked their way up and through to get to the border, now have to go back and put a strain on the shelters, the streets, the dangers of gangs. Again, in a real violation of what we had promised through our Refugee Act. That and then last March, after COVID had started, using not an immigration authority, but a public health authority to say, we're not going to even let anybody in. That's being challenged in the courts because of, again, improper use of the wrong law to say, but the idea that you can't even come in. My research in talking with medical authorities and literature reflects much of our Christian ethic, that when we build walls and borders, we often hurt the people inside the wall rather than those excluding. In past epidemics and past pandemics and the like, when we've tried to do this and put the wall and keep people out, it stops the public health ability to work on both sides of a border and actually exacerbates the problem. But that didn't stop this administration. A couple other quick things. The Attorney General, the immigration courts are called courts, but they're not independent courts. They're employees of the Attorney General, and the Attorney General can take any decision of an immigration judge or an appellate immigration judge and rewrite a new precedent decision. And Attorney Generals under Session and Barr have done that. And they've eviscerated a lot of the protections. Women fleeing domestic violence in Central America, men, women, and children fleeing gangs in Central America. The Attorney General has written a decision saying that's not an asylum case, that's not a refugee case. You're not eligible. We're litigating that in the courts, but it just shows you that it's not. We're dismantling the rule of law. A couple other things, refugee resettlement. That's another way of getting asylum, or not asylum, but refugee protection. That is often done overseas. And every year the president says, we're going to accept so many refugees. It's ranged anywhere from, we had a load after 9/11 of around 20,000 up to 120,000 during the height of the Cold War. This administration last year brought it down to less than 15,000. So these are people who I've worked with refugees in Jordan and Lesbos in Greece, who have fled Syria, fled Afghanistan, uh, uh, countries in Africa. And we used to offer hospitality and refuge to them. And we cut this down to 15,000. Other critical, when you cut that many down, this was a beautiful program. In fact, the late Dr. Ed Silverman out of Illinois was kind of the individual who helped build a national refugee resettlement. Illinois has been a leader in that, and working with faith communities all around the country to resettle refugees in our communities. When you cut the numbers from 100 to 15, those institutions like Refugee One in Chicago, Catholic Charities, Heartland Alliance, World Relief, they have to let go staff. They're not processing as many refugees. So this is one of the question marks. Even though the Biden administration says we're going to accept 100,000 refugees, has this infrastructure been so dismantled that it's going to be hard to get that going quickly? But we're going to have to work on that. One other quick thing, and then I'll just say what Biden's going to do and then turn it to Vanessa. Just employment policies and procedures. One of the tragedies of World War II, there were 10 or 20,000 visas eligible for Jews fleeing Europe, but the people in the State Department were anti-Semitic and didn't process paperwork very quickly. They let it sit on their desks. People could have come out lawfully and escaped. And then when Hitler took over all the countries in Europe, the consulates were closed and those people were condemned. The same thing's happening now. People are slowing down the processing. We're dropping these kinds of things. We're also being hyper technical. If there's a question on an application and it asks about your employment and your application is for an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old, and that you leave it blank or put NA, they're rejecting the application. It's improperly filled out. So there's all these kinds of little tricks of the trade where applications are getting returned for insufficient evidence and people are being denied. So the processing is going down and the logjam gets longer and it takes longer. So it's not just, it's actually hard to represent people now because of these difficulties. Okay, where's the good news? All right. The Biden plan for securing our values as a nation of immigrants. And you can go on his website and get it. It's about an 80 or 90 page document. I don't have the time to tell you all of it. Interesting that this administration that's in power now took out "We're a Nation of Immigrants" from its webpage, right? So this is obviously to return us to that value. But when I went to the Biden page, there's not a separate link for immigration, and it's under foreign policy. So that's a little bit of a concern because these are a lot of also domestic issues, right? Also now, as we look at the changes, we have to understand what was the change made by the Trump administration? Was it an executive order? Was it a court case? Was it a regulation? Was it promulgated or still in a proposed status? And that'll help us understand how quickly, if it has great intent, it can still unwind these negatives. So they've proposed end the Muslim travel ban day one. Important and symbolic. That was the first act of the Trump administration. Let's open that and take that away. That's done because it was done by executive order. Stop family separation at the borders. One of the real tragedies, right? This is complicated because actually had started in some way under the Obama administration, ramped up tremendously as we saw, technically stopped, but there are issues with unaccompanied children, knowing our children being smuggled. There are, I have confessed, they're very difficult issues. We have ways to addressing this, but the Biden administration is going to work with that to end this migrant protection protocol, forcing people out and waiting. That may not be day one. They might say that, but imagine again the practical problems we're going to have now, that if we have a new surge of people, it's going to cause all kinds of administrative problems. So one of the things the Biden-Harris administration has to do is figure out how to get rid of these policies and then be prepared to deal with this in one sense. Title 42, that needs to be changed as well. This idea that the pandemic is causing greater problems. Get rid of private detention, and also just the emphasis on detention. The system had worked where people were came in. Remember this idea, the process, you come in, I'm afraid, okay, we'll process you and we'll put you online to have a hearing, right? Often people came to family members, but also came to faith groups and communities and churches, hospitals, mosques and synagogues, and also collectives, right? We have some of that on our own network. In fact, the Biden administration in their proposal highlights a faith community, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, that they may look to us. So we need to be prepared as faith communities to help say, we can help deal with this. And so, but that's going to be something we need to work with that. But also to get rid of this idea of detention. One of the issues we face, the private detention companies make so much money by housing individuals that they have lobbyists to just spend the time of Congress saying, require ICE, require DHS to put more of these folks in detention, because then they may get paid per head per day. And so we've got to unpack that and stop this incentive for people to make money off of detaining people. And we also need to change personnel and policies. The immigration courts, as well as the citizenship and immigration services, the folks to do the paperwork. There are some good people there, but there are also some people who've been planted who are Stephen Miller clones who want to dismantle the system. And it's going to take really good management and really effective people to be put in those positions to ensure that we can process applications. If we switch our mentality to be one of reception rather than enforcement, and have staff who are working to say, oh, you've got one mistake here, we could fix that out. Let's, instead of throwing the application out, expecting them to come in. And finally, before I turn to Vanessa, enforcement discretion. One of the things that was a major change, every prosecutor, whether it's immigration or otherwise, has discretion. How many of you drive more than 40 miles on Lakeshore Drive, right? If any of us who drove more than 40 miles an hour on Lakeshore Drive got a ticket, there'd be a traffic jam on Lakeshore Drive every day, right? And so we've all passed a police car, or many of us, I don't know where we're all from, but think of that. How many of us have sped in a car that went by a radar and we're not stopped? Okay? So good, effective law enforcement is deciding where to prioritize enforcement. The Obama-Biden administration 4 years ago said, let's go after the felons, let's go after the people that are the most problematic for being part of our society. This administration said, this Trump administration came and said, anyone who's undocumented, anyone whose paperwork is improper, deport. Deport and ask questions later, was probably the attitude, right? This has to change. Again, it's in terms of good enforcement policies to make the best use of your time. That will be important, but it'll also take a while to work its way down to the system. The U.S. Border Patrol was one of the first unions to come out in favor of the Trump candidacy, right? They gave it some, and they have grown, and many of them in that office like that power they've been given. And so this is going to be a major thing that we're going to have to all do. So I'm going to turn to Vanessa, talk about some of the doc. There's some other amazing stuff, and then we can find out what you all are interested in.
Wow, thank you, Craig. I feel like I've learned so much, and I really appreciate your approach in terms of providing the legal history and just the history of policy regarding refugees and immigrants here in the U.S. So thank you for that. I'm going to take a different approach because more of a personal approach, because I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a professor, but I am a spiritual care provider. And I've been doing this on a university campus for several years, both here at the University of Southern California and prior to that at Stanford University. So, and maybe before I get started, I just want to say, hey, everyone. Nice to see some familiar faces out there. It's such a pleasure to be here. First off, I want to acknowledge that this campus and this city that I'm calling in from was built on the ancestral lands of the Tongva people. So I want to just take this moment to pay my respects to Tongva elders, past, present, and future, who have stewarded this sacred land throughout the generations, and to honor their extraordinary traditions, identities, and stories, which are too often ignored. And it definitely is in relation to today's topic, because I want us to be reminded of the many legacies of violence, of displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us all together here today, whether it's virtual or not, wherever you find yourself today. There are many legacies that have contributed to our being. So here at CTS, I learned that context matters. Our social location in this world, that combination of intersecting factors such as gender, ethnicity, class, age, ability, orientation, and even our geographic location, and of course our religions, all of that informs our present being. So I'm going to start with a quick review of my context. I'm a second generation Filipina American, born in Arizona and raised on the island of Guam. My mom, she left her very remote farming village in the Philippines at the age of 12. Of course, she did this against her family's wishes. She left her family behind, actually, at this young age. And why did she do this? She wanted to go to high school. Yeah. And in order to go to high school, she had to move to a big city. And so the closest city to her at that time in the 60s was Batangas. And this is all in the Philippines, of course. And what ended up happening was she found work with an affluent family. She lived in as their nanny and housekeeper, and they paid her tuition so she could go to school. And they made it possible such that she could attend classes in the evening and graduate from high school 5 years later. It took her 5 years. She went on to college. And of course, she was the first in her family to achieve both these education milestones. And anyhow, a short time later, she fell in love. She immigrated to the US. I believe that was 1975. And she was the first in her family to leave the country, to become fluent in English, and to pursue a dream beyond her farm, where she had learned to, harvest corn and sugarcane, peanuts and rice. It's a pretty sad story, leaving your family at age 12. She only got to see them probably 3 days out of the year for the next, 5 to 8 years after that. And then moving to the US, she would only get to see them, once every several years. And I wanted to share that story with you so that you understand my family's motivation for settling on Turtle Island. Our motivation was this American dream. It was education. It was so many things. And I am a product of my mother's American dream. So when she moved to Arizona in 75, she was met with a ton of challenges. The sadness of leaving her family and her country behind, it really consumed her. But she dared to dream that she could find work that would sustain her, that would sustain our extended family. And she dreamed that her children, that my sister and I would go to college, and that we would find our own form of success in this nation. So fast forward to 2017, I'm here in Los Angeles. I'm working in the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life at USC. And no joke, I snuck into my office today because I'm not supposed to be here. But my boss gave me the thumbs up. But anyhow, here at USC, the provost gave me the distinction of being university point person to support our undocumented students here in our Trojan community. So in this role, I work with our advisory task force on immigration to advocate for our student and our staff needs in regards to their immigration status. As a religious leader, as a chaplain, I, of course, also provide confidential counseling to those seeking my support. So I began meeting with students just as the Trump administration called for the end of DACA. That was fall 2017. And it was an abrupt stop. Yeah, I just remember hearing these stories from these young adults here. I heard stories of their family's migration, many of them mirroring my own family story, but many others articulating experiences, violence, fear, poverty, just hopelessness. And yet these students, first of all, many of them first generation college students on this campus, right? And their parents are so proud of them. And yet, here they are living in fear, right? For themselves or for their families and, just for their extended community. So when I started this work, I did my best, right? I did my best. I wanted to be present to the sacred, right? In our spiritual care encounters, as well as the sacredness of their storytelling. So I bared witness to tears, to anger, to the pain of uncertainty in their future. For some of these students, fears were compounded by their pursuit of higher education, especially at a private university. Financial aid is not a guarantee, and especially for students with this immigration status. And even more, not every DACA student has work authorization, nor do they have eligibility for federal work study. So we already know that the cost of education is absurd, and it's compounded the stress of this for these students. So here we're seeing an intersection of oppressions, right? Where one's dreams may not become reality due to existing systemic violence. So these students I met, they were from across the globe with families originating Taiwan, Nigeria, Iran, Philippines, and yes, Central and South America. It was with these stories in mind that I had submitted that application for the Shulman Award, the Interreligious Leadership Award. I think that was in 2018. With that award, I was able to create an opportunity on this campus where such stories could be shared and celebrated. These students could be heard beyond sort of the small group peer counseling sessions we had set up, but their voices could be heard and elevated. I remember students submitted stories in the form of like artwork, dance, song, poem, other creative forms. And, I'm in LA, so this is the, La La Land, Hollywood. And so I was blown away by the creativity of these students. They drew on their personal experiences, religious worldviews, lived values, family histories, and other sources of inspiration. And they did this in order to inform and educate our campus audience, because so often, we can go about our lives and not realize, it's like 1 in 3 people live with someone who's, either undocumented or has a family member who's undocumented and so forth. These people all are our neighbors, and these students are on our campus. And so I was glad that the award made it possible for me to really celebrate those students and their artwork. So yeah, CTS taught me that storytelling is not only sacred, but it's transformative. I think Craig may have mentioned this already, or maybe not. I've been talking a lot on immigration, so I'm trying to remember what I have and had not said. But just in the last few days, you may have been reading the news, the restrictions on DACA were lifted, such that new applicants are being accepted. And so that was what Trump had shut down back in 2017. The courts were only accepting renewal applications. So you would have had to already receive DACA status before then in order to continue receiving the benefits. So the eligibility now remains the same. You have to be under the age of 31 as of 2012. You have to have come to the US when you were under the age of 16. And you have to have continuously resided in the US since June 15, 2007, up until the present. So think about that for a minute. Because as you know, Craig and I, we both work at private universities, and just think about what that means for the students we're seeing on our campuses. It means they had to have been born in 2004 or later, and that means they would have been here for at least 13 years already. So what I'm getting at is that only some of my undocumented students actually meet these parameters. There are many more students who are ineligible and as such cannot benefit from the resources that are afforded via DACA. So really, what I'm saying is this next administration under Biden and Harris has to do some really bold rethinking of DACA and all our immigration policies. It needs to change, they need to change eligibility requirements. They need to consider broadening its availability, but furthermore, we need to find a pathway to citizenship that makes sense for the US. And yes, a pathway to citizenship, because otherwise these long-time residents, which that's what they are at this point, these long-time residents, they are paying taxes and they are contributing to our society. And yet they will continue to live at the margins, and they will continue to be punished for their very existence of being outside of our systems and our policies. And so that is what I task the Biden and Harris administration to do. And that is what I task our faith communities and all our organizations to really push for the type of immigration change we need to see. Because as much as DACA has afforded so many resources, there are so many students and families being left behind. You know, as Craig was speaking, I was reminded, so like I said, I was brought up on Guam. And for those of you who don't know, Guam is part of the Marianas Islands. It's in the Pacific. It's a US territory. And if you want to talk about legacies of violence, just ask me about it later. But in terms of our topic, immigrants and refugees, I can recall, I must have been 12 or 13 at the time, but I can recall driving by the military base in Hagåtña back in 1996 and seeing a lot of temporary structures being erected. Now, keep in mind, Guam is a tiny island. I think the population was like less than 100,000 at the time. So, and I just have to mention, we had one homeless person on the island that I was aware of at that young age. One homeless person on the island, and that was a lifestyle choice made by that particular man. He preferred to be on the beach. So I say that because I remember asking my parents, like, what was going on with the structures over on the military base? And because we were not a military family, but you could see certain parts of it as you drive the main road. And it turned out Guam was going to house a few thousand Kurdish refugees. The US at the time felt an obligation to these refugees because Saddam Hussein had threatened to inflict punishment because of their work with US aid agencies. So a few thousand refugees came to our small island of Guam to live in these structures. So most of the refugees went on, they sought sanctuary, and the vast majority resettled on the mainland. So the decision to move Kurds to Guam enabled them to be considered for parole, which in the US without the sort of preliminary decisions on visas and refugee status that Craig was referencing, because typically you would need such visas and so forth processed overseas. So I guess I'm just sort of putting these pieces together because it's interesting to me. In that particular case on Guam, the US acknowledged its responsibility to a people and even moved them, used their own planes and everything to bring them to a US territory such that they could receive parole without visas. So of course, this makes me think of the thousands of people who are arriving at our borders, who are seeking asylum. And in a similar fashion to that military base, We have erected shelters, which are not temporary at all. They are prisons. And those residing there do not have visas, but are seeking our support. Our systems are broken, though. Their appeals for support will not be fast tracked, and instead, they are living as prisoners and still being separated from family members, and of course, facing deportation and so many things. So, this is yet another legacy of American violence that is being perpetrated on those who simply they found hope in the possibility of residing in the US, and we are detaining them. So I think I've sort of met my time for this, but I think you get a good sense of my work, the students, and the challenges that face us ahead. In a minute, I'm going to post a couple links to a few local or national organizations that have proven helpful to me in my work and can be a resource to you, and especially if you're looking to support immigrants and refugees. So I'll put that in the chat. And I think Amy will likely send out the links here too. So just perhaps one closing note, because I think so much of our work is personal, and we should connect it to the global. So my mom came over in 1975. She became a citizen in 1981, probably. And she petitioned her family members. She had 3 younger siblings. And the sad news is it took 25 years for them to approve that petition. And so, but perhaps the good news is those 3 multiplied into families of 4. And I guess the happy ending is that just 2 years ago, I had 10 family members become American citizens. So it's such something that I'm so happy to have them here, because living so far away from family has caused so much grief for my family. And so it's a whole new world having them here in the States. So lastly, CTS likes to lift us up, speaking of students, as leaders for the next. But the truth is, you don't have to be radical. You don't have to be early to support any cause. Really, I just urge you to show up. Showing up is enough. Demonstrate your values through action. Show up for your brothers and sisters who are literally calling out for your support. So I think I'll leave it at that, and let's get to this discussion.